Montreal, my God! Hundreds of cultures and languages, 6 universities, and 12 junior colleges. I got here in 1988, and it's never stopped nourishing my intellect and filling me with hope. Remember the most amazing conversations you ever had? How alive you felt? Remember how the music sounded? A life like that never stopped in Montreal. Its sidewalk cafes buzz and pop with debate, laughter, and most of all, stimulating topics. Not gossip, not glibness, just enthusiasm and deep, challenging thoughts. These people are a treat. Come meet them with me. I'm Mike Rudd, a Montreal jazz guitar player with a passion for science, philosophy, history, literature, and of course, music. Over the years, I've met and learned from a small army of people here who, like me, couldn't resist the allure of this beautiful region. I've kept in touch with these amazing people for you. They're waiting in this enticing place to talk to you about crucial ideas, the stuff that makes life so interesting. Come now, listen in and enjoy my view from Montreal. It must have been around 2006 when I met Andrew. I was flying into Ottawa, and the guy in the seat next to me was looking over at me. Finally, he said, "Are you a guitar player?" We figured out that we had played together in a jazz band in Montreal back when he was a trumpet player long ago. Now, many years later, Andrew was an evolutionary biologist at Carleton University. I had so many questions. A few years earlier, Darwin's way of understanding the world had changed everything for me. Look in your backyard or in the park down the street. What do you see? Things surviving or not surviving? And then if they manage to leave a near copy of themselves behind, the better that copy does, the more offspring it will leave behind. Based on that, you should expect to see things that have saved up every useful way of making it into the next generation. And nobody needs to be running things for this process to happen. It all just follows automatically when you get copies surviving, if and only if they have inherited the right happy accidents, the types of bodies and brains that'll let them reproduce successfully. That essential self-creating property is what I find so compelling. It was obviously that way for biologist Andrew Simons too. I was back in Ottawa in June of 2015 to record my CD, Miniatures, and Andrew graciously agreed to sit down in his Carleton University office and walk me through some of the strange and arresting aspects of how life creates itself. What is evolutionary biology? What are people studying when they study it?
You know, you look at the world around you, and I mean, you can sort of bury your head in books and you know, screens and that sort of thing. But if you look around at all and you start thinking about the incredible diversity of life, that's I think what hit me is like, where did that come from? You know, and I tend to think in terms of I guess naturalistic laws to begin with, and sort of explaining that diversity was really striking. And my father, actually, what's interesting, he was a singer, and he used to pull us out of school once a year for a whole week at a time and take us to Point Pelee to birdwatch, because he was an avid birdwatcher, even though he was a classical singer. And he wasn't really interested in biology in any other way. But I remember when he was identifying these warblers, they all look like little yellow things, right? And I'd look at the bird guide and say, but Dad, these things all look pretty much the same. They have like a little stripe here and, you know, the other one doesn't. And so I guess at that point I started thinking about the fact that they must be pretty closely related. And I think that's when I started getting a little bit interested in the natural world to begin with and in evolution. But when I went to university, I went into biology, and it was only in my last year that I really became interested in evolutionary biology. I took a course with a brilliant philosopher of science and biologist, Michael Roos, his name is, and he taught a course in England. Actually, he took us all over there, and it was called Darwin in London. And it was on that course that I really started thinking about evolution and how much it could explain in terms of this diversity of life.
Because it doesn't have to be limited by the constraints of what you can imagine.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And another fascinating thing about evolution, I find, is the things that don't look quite right. For example, you have pelvic girdles in whales, and where did that come from?
Oh, yeah. What is this? This is what is the pelvic girdle in a whale? This is...
Well, it's the femur, and you have the pelvic girdle itself. They're just remnants. They're vestigial.
So these used to be back limbs.
That's right, yeah. And it's just the easiest explanation for that, the most sort of parsimonious explanation, is that they were once tetrapods on land,
right?
And they still are. They develop as tetrapods. Like their limbs are pentadactyl. They have 5 digits.
They still have 5
develop,
digits.
And just like horses that walk on one of them, that third digit they walk around on. But in development, there are, I forget which digits are which, but some just never develop at all, and a couple of the others do, and then they disappear during development. And
wow.
How else can you explain that except that they share a common ancestry with all other pentadactyl tetrapods?
Such a simpler explanation that they had a great grandmother where that thing didn't get inhibited; it got fully expressed.
That's right,
because it wasn't. It was a useful thing for it to have it.
Yeah, that's right.
So tetrapods, that is, creatures with 4 limbs, like a dog or us, are related to whales. This is no surprise to you. But the interesting part is that nature leaves clues. And these clues are what evolutionary biologists like Andrew find so interesting, because they're not immediately obvious, but they speak loudly. He mentioned the pelvic girdle on a whale, and this is tiny bones inside the whale's body. They're there, but don't really appear to do what we would think of legs as doing. They're invisible from the outside. Maybe they don't even do anything at all. This is a powerful piece of evidence that whales come from that family, tetrapods, but that over time in the water, every whale ancestor with too much hind leg had more trouble not dying, had more trouble staying alive. In time, the ones with less and less leg were the ones who had kids, and those kids and the kids of those kids are the ones that we see today. That's my understanding. In the case of horses, it gets even weirder. Andrew called them pentadactyl tetrapods. This means 5 fingers, 4 legs. Horses started out with an ancestor with 5 fingers, and now their hoof is a variation on just one great big finger. And there's plenty of evidence that the other former fingers have slowly been phased out. That hoof is, just as you'd then suspect, made of the same stuff your fingernails are made from: keratin. Nature is bursting with very specific pieces of peculiar evidence for evolution like this. If the hoof isn't a variation on the finger, why does the end of it have essentially a giant fingernail on it? Why would the whale have these apparently useless bones hidden exactly in the same spot that we would have our hind legs? The simple explanation is that the whale came from a creature that did use those limbs, and there was no guiding intelligence that simply, poof, vanished the limbs. Instead, the marine mammals with shorter and shorter hind limbs had better luck in that environment. As if this wasn't enough, we can see many cases where nature clearly wasn't planning ahead, like the crazy example of the recurrent laryngeal nerve in giraffes.
There's a nerve that is shared amongst all mammals, and it's the laryngeal nerve, so it feeds the larynx. And it in a regular organism without a very long neck, it makes total sense for it to loop around a structure in the chest.
Yeah.
And so when you start sending a giraffe's neck up in the air through evolution, this nerve has to travel, I think it's a 20-foot waist of nerve that goes all the way up the neck, just to come all the way back down again to where it could have been a few centimeters. If evolution was capable of simply detaching that nerve and reattaching it.
Take one generation off.
That's right.
And do a reboot.
That's right.
Just
yeah. But that's an example of a developmental constraint.
So we share a common ancestor with giraffes. That ancestor had a nerve connecting the brain to the larynx in a way that looped around another structure in the chest. Back in that ancestor, this little loop wasn't a very long trip. But in the line of animals that eventually became the giraffe, the neck slowly got longer and longer and longer, because there was no one generation where nature could just stop the presses and unloop that nerve. The nerve had to also slowly get longer and longer along with the neck. Now, in giraffes, the recurrent laryngeal nerve connecting the brain to the larynx could be just inches long. But because of how the animal evolved, it wastes about 15 feet of nerve to make this totally unnecessary loop. And you can be sure a guy like Andrew could point to any number of these slam-dunk examples of evolution, leaving unmistakable clues. But of course, living things don't live in a vacuum, not even close. Their worlds are always changing, and organisms must keep up. Andrew's questions are about how living things evolve to cope with environmental change, specifically how their bodies can change, not just over generations, but within one lifetime.
When environmental variation is predictable, we expect the evolution of phenotypic plasticity.
Okay,
so that's the
phenotype being the way the body gets expressed by the genes.
That's right. So phenotype, that's just what you can measure about an organism. So a phenotype could be arm length. It could be some personality, even. You know, anything you can measure, even if it's measured with a lot of error. That's a phenotype. And so phenotypic plasticity is the ability of organisms to adjust, sort of on the fly, within a lifetime, adjust the phenotypic expression of a trait. So
I'm a guitar player, so the calluses at the end of my fingers are kind of phenotypic plasticity.
That's right.
This is well, I put them against these pieces of metal all the time, and luckily, some aspect makes your skin thicker when it's constantly stressed.
That's right. Yeah.
But
and you go work out in the gym and your muscles get bigger. You know, that's plasticity as well.
Right.
Now, we have to then distinguish between plasticity in general and adaptive phenotypic plasticity. And sometimes they're really hard to distinguish. Like if you're growing some insects and you have two different containers, one is warm and one is cold, the insects developing in the warmer container, assuming it's not too warm, will develop much more quickly than the ones in the cold containers. And that, there might be some adaptive explanation for that, but my immediate reaction would be that's not adaptive plasticity. That is phenotypic plasticity, but it's just a result of chemical reactions occurring more quickly. Sort of Q10 arguments more quickly when it's warm than when it's cold. So the physiology kind of slows down when it's cold. But then there's some really good examples of adaptive phenotypic plasticity. And to distinguish between them, you actually have to test them. You can't just come up with a story.
You can't just do it from the hip.
Right. If I want to claim that a particular trait, is adaptive phenotypic plasticity, then I better show that it has some advantage under the circumstances in which it's expressed, and that it is better. It makes the organism better suited to the environment if it has that trait than if it does not have that trait.
And you're talking about the trait of this kind of ability to change, elicited from the local environment in the moment, right?
Yeah. So there's some good examples. One of the sort of classic examples is this little water flea, Daphnia, that if it encounters basically the smell, if it detects the presence of a predator, a fish predator, it will develop spines and a helmet-like structure, and this occurs over a matter of hours. So this is very rapid.
Right.
This is development as opposed to evolution. Of course, the ability to develop that has evolved. So even that seems so obvious, that it's protecting itself against a predator. You've got to test that.
Yeah.
And there are various ways to test that. You can just see how it survives with the helmet and and the spines compared to without.
Right.
And so the question would come, well, why? Why wouldn't it always have this helmet and these spines if it's so beneficial? And it turns out, well, the test has been done, and there's a cost. There was a really nice study by Demeester et al. I don't know what year that was, but where they had Daphnia taken out of lakes where they know there was no history of fish, where there was some history of fish, and there was a lot of fish in the other lakes. So a really clean experiment. They bring them back to the lab and asked. This is actually not asking just about plasticity, but about the evolution of plasticity.
Right.
And they found that the level of plasticity, that is the ability to change, and this wasn't the helmets, it was a behavioral response they were looking at, like diving out of the way of the predators.
Yeah.
They were able, only the Daphnia taken from the lake with fish predators were able to actually did express that plasticity in response to predators. So the others didn't react to the cue at all. They didn't dive out of the way of the predators. It was phototac. It was a chemotactic response to the predators again. So in response to this chemical cue, the level of plasticity was much lower in the lake without any predators.
So, okay.
And these are the offspring of the offspring of the offspring.
This is exactly the distinction I want to draw, because, it could be easy to mistake that for the story of the dodos not running away from the first people to come to those islands.
Yeah.
This is the ability of that animal. This is how much has its environment selected for it.
That's right.
To have this. Well, in that case, I think in ethology they would have called it a fixed action pattern.
Okay, yeah.
Right? Like it's in response to environmental cue, and it forces you to play out a specific script, like I'm going to dive when this little chemical is in the water around me.
Yeah.
And so how much has the local population of these fish, or is it a fish, or does
No, this is a little water flea.
Little water flea. How much has that little pocket of those fleas been forced to become something that could change that fast?
That's right.
It's not just those particular ones. It's that whole population and how it's evolved that ability to change.
That's right.
Compared to another population of them that can't make that change on face, because its lake didn't have the predators in it pushing it in that direction.
That's right. And this isn't just like a learned response somehow or anything like that, because what they did is they were very careful with their design. They brought them, I said that they tested them on these Daphnia that they brought back from the lakes. Well, they brought them back from the lakes, but then took them through several generations under lab conditions with no chemical cues at all, and then asked their offspring, how do you react to
they challenged them in that sense. They put the chemical that they know is the trigger in the water. So they had no chance to pick it up as a piece of information that it had a learned response to.
Yeah. And so then you think, well, okay, it's hard enough to imagine simple traits evolving, like any trait you want to think about, running speed or that kind of thing. But the ability to respond appropriately to a change in environment.
That's
how does that evolve?
Subtle.
Yeah, and it turns out that what you need to evolve that sort of response is something called genotype environment interaction. So genetic variation, you need genetic variation for anything to evolve.
Yeah.
So in this case, you need genetic variation for plasticity.
Right.
So that means that different genotypes, for that trait to evolve, there had to be genotypes that reacted differently to that same change in condition. So fish or no fish.
Yeah.
If everybody in one lake, if all of the Daphnia reacted the same way, let's say early in the evolution of this chemotactic response, and there was no variation in how they responded, you could never get the increased response evolving to chemical
because
cues.
The first generation to have hit them, nobody would have had any set of genes that pushed them in the direction of being able to have this other phenotype that they could display.
Yeah. So that's how you get the separation among the three lakes, is that there still is actually genotype environment interaction. So what that means is that is that different genotypes respond differently to the same change in environment.
Different genotypes respond differently to the same change in environment.
So you have two different environments, a fish present and a fish not present. We just picture one lake, though. Fish present and a fish not present. Those are two different environments, right? And if you have a whole lot of Daphnia in there, and you observe that some of them don't react much at all, and others react a lot, that is genotype environment interaction. We're assuming that different Daphnia have different genotypes.
Right.
So that is the stuff on which natural selection can act, is the reaction to those two different environments. People do study the evolution of phenotypic plasticity, and you know, it's this very well-established thing now that in order for plasticity to evolve, so the ability to respond correctly, if you want to put it that way, to a change in environment, requires that genetic variation exists. What is genetic variation? That is, in this case, for this complicated trait, it's genotype-environment interaction. That's different genotypes reacting differently to the same change in environment.
So to have enough variability present in the, let's say you got 200,000 of these bugs.
Yeah.
But if they were all a clone of the same bug, there'd be nothing for evolution to act differentially on.
That's right.
It would either sink or swim on the basis of that one type of of DNA that it's got.
Yeah, sink or swim is exactly.
It's literally what it would
perfect. do. Yeah. So they might respond slightly to a chemical cue of a predator, let's say, but everyone will just be reacting slightly. So that can evolve. They'll always react slightly.
There's nothing to be better at than your neighbor was at, because the only difference between whether you got eaten or your neighbor did is where you happen to be. And that's no part of your genes chose that. It's just purely which way the water blew you that day.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, the amount of variation limits how quickly evolution can occur. And specifically, the amount of genetic variation limits how quickly evolution can occur. And so in this case, yes, it's exactly right. The trait we're talking about happens to be a complicated trait, is the degree to which an organism responds to a predator. That is the trait, the degree to which they respond. So there's got to be variation in that degree to which they respond for that trait to evolve.
There's got to be a lot of variation for evolution to operate. I think my creative artist friends will agree with me that this is as true in art as it is in evolution. Lots and lots and lots of attempts, trial balloons. Without a lot of options, it's hard to see what else can exist. But a little success in one direction can lead to something truly viable, something that can stand up to how hard the world can be. It's as true for musicianship as it is for Daphnia. I left Andrew's office that day full of thoughts and showed up the next afternoon at a studio in Ottawa's Glebe neighborhood, ready to record some music, my mind full of new options, ready to make as many cuts as necessary to be left with something unique, something strong. Thank you, Andrew. I hope we can speak again soon. Check out my other interviews with interesting thinkers from the sciences and arts. If anyone has any questions for the blog, you can reach me at michaeljamesrudd@gmail.com. That's michaeljamesrudd with one D @gmail.com. Thanks to Tony Chamberlain for sound production, and thank you for listening.